To know Paul Salamunovich, or as we called him, Pop or Dad, was to know that it was his heart that led him to most things. And this was fortunate for those of us who had a chance to collaborate with him or just to enjoy the fruits of his labor as he brought so much of it to his work. It was his heart that called to him in the darkness of Redondo Beach movie theater when he was 10 years old. After sitting through a double feature, the movie-tone newsreel came on, and during a short section on Hitler's rise to power and the one thing that could vanquish it, they played the Santa Maria portion of what would become his signature a cappella piece, the Vittoria Ave Maria. He was so transfixed that he stayed all through the double feature again, just to hear those same 8 bars of ecstasy. This moment was a gift from God that stamped him for life. The next time he heard those same 8 bars was not long afterward, during a concert by Roger Wagner's Men and Boys Choir at St. James, his home parish, where he sang in the boys' choir, under Father Louis Buchner, who first introduced him to liturgical music. When the family moved to Hollywood in his 7th grade year, he enrolled here at Blessed Sacrament and sang in the boys' choir under Richard Keys Biggs, who schooled him in the basics of music. Biggs introduced him to Wagner, and he began taking the streetcar downtown to St. Joseph's, where Wagner rehearsed that choir and watched the rehearsals until one day Roger said, "Hey kid, you're always here, you might as well sing." So from an early age, the music became his muse, and from that time on, it's had little competition, though he was known to rhapsodize over great food. Being afraid of asking my mom for their first date, he actually chickened out of asking her at the moment of truth for his junior prom at Hollywood High. A year later, he managed to have just enough courage to rush up to her and ask, "What are you doing on June such and such?" She said, "Nothing." So he said, "Would you like to go to the senior prom with me?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Okay." And then he turned and ran away as fast as he could. That moment happened about 400 yards that way. They danced every dance, and my mom thought she'd died and gone to heaven to finally find someone who was willing to dance. The truth was, he wasn't really that interested in dancing, but he found it far more easier to face than actually having to talk to her because he was so painfully shy. Paul always cited his conducting the St. Charles Choir at High Mass in St. Peter's Square with the Pope as celebrant as a high point in his life. All this is that much more improbable given the circumstances around his actual hiring at St. Charles and started conducting. As Father Al mentioned earlier today, when he was appointed choir director in a sales job that Roger perpetrated on Monsignor Meade, he found himself at full terror at the prospect of suddenly standing in front of a choir and trying to pretend he thought he was enough of a musician to do it. At 21 years old, he had never conducted anything, and he panicked at the thought. But by then, Roger had sealed the deal with the Monsignor and added inaccurately that Paul could also play the organ. Then, contrary to popular myth, Roger gave Paul the one and only actual instructional moment that ever actually transpired between them when he demonstrated the chronomies of the 2, 3, and 4 time signatures. And then when Paul asked Roger, "What do I do now?" he indeed said, "Start practicing." Into this dilemma-fraught situation, he plunged into the literal equivalent of sink or swim, but somehow it worked, and it worked beautifully. It was the love of the music, the sound he heard in his heart, and his ability to convey that to the heart of others that saved him. And it saved him for the next 60-plus years, because behind it all, he had imposter syndrome the whole time. It's a good thing, too, because he never would have thought himself enough of a conductor to pursue it on his own. In Paul's intense efforts to prepare choirs for other conductors, he managed to forge his own way to his own sound, so the progression to his own choirs was a fairly natural one. But it would only have been possible with others asking him to do it, as he never once applied for a position or an engagement in his life. His sense of ambition was relegated to doing the work at hand, but he exerted little influence or focus on the big picture of his career. Thank God for Father Train, Father Kremens, and so many others who looked out for him. Besides music, he was the first to tell you that the only alternative talents he possessed were house painter and bookkeeper, as his meticulous record keeping would attest. I asked him several years ago if he was ever afraid that they were going to knock on the door and say, "We found you out, you're a fraud, so hand over the keys." He answered, "Every day." He knew that there were conductors who could reduce and transpose scores at the piano and memorize those same scores and other such impressive displays of prodigious musicianship. But that wasn't what he offered, so he never pretended to it. What he offered was a glimpse into his heart. And there, amongst all the considerable imperfection of being human on planet Earth, was a jewel of perfection birthed from his indelible love of the music. It allowed him to speak directly to the heart of others with this single gift. This unmistakable vision and love of the sound he heard inside allowed him to come out of his shyness, protected by its power, its clarity, its rightness to claim the direction he offered to others, to come and see the view from his vantage point, as he always put it, the mountaintop. Sure enough, the view never disappointed. And time after time, he managed to miraculously get his sound, the Salamunovich sound, from any choir, no matter what singers or how little rehearsal time. So many know the stories and analogies he seemed to cobble together out of thin air to describe intangible subjects and things like tone and phrasing in such a strangely concrete way that even someone tone deaf seemed to understand the vividness of it. His 60-year tenure at St. Charles was certainly remarkable, especially given the success he was enjoying around the world. But he stayed at St. Charles because of love and because his heart was there with the people who made up his choir family. So many sang year after year, starting in the children's choir at Loyola Marymount or Mount St. Mary's, and singing for many years on up to his retirement. They supported, consoled, and celebrated with each other. When one of them passed, they were lovingly bid exactly the way he stipulated he wanted done here today, with the singers not up in the choir loft, but sitting in the pews where the family would sit and singing from there. Leading the St. Charles Choir was really the best way he knew how to pray to his God. The plaque dedicated to him on the wall in the choir loft at St. Charles features one of his favorite statements: "Bis orat quis bene canta." He who sings well prays twice. When he played the organ, his conducting hands were busy, so he developed all those crazy faces we all saw to take the place of his hands. On the times when his hands were free to conduct, his face added another 2 hands at least to the evocation he brought forth from the performers. He demanded involvement because he modeled it. Not once did he ever just go someplace and start phoning it in. If the music wasn't sounding good enough to please him, he got more insistent rather than bored. And by hook or crook, he cajoled, pleaded, browbeat, slammed his hand on the piano or organ, or any number of other methods and tools available, until the sound in his imagination and the one floating through the air matched. And once you made it to that point, there was no turning back. He just plain wouldn't allow it. His intention in doing what he did was totally transparent to the orchestras and choirs he conducted. And even if it came in the form of exasperation or anger, he always modeled an honesty and a sincerity that seems to have made an impact on so many of you who have written the heartfelt tributes we've received over the past month. And because the end result was always for everyone's benefit, we all trusted him and followed him time and time again. He had a very childlike sense of humor and giggled like a schoolboy at jokes that had salty language in them. The intimacy he shared with the men's chorus was based on the fact that he could trust them to know when to get down to business and when to have just the right joke to keep things fun. And he was more than up to the challenge to throw the barbs around with the guys. Hooray for Paul, hooray at last. If any of you don't know what that means, just ask some of the guys that are laughing. Although he could conduct the Beethoven Missa Solemnis, he couldn't double-click a computer mouse to save his life. Pop would routinely call my brother Joseph with questions about things like how to set the clock on his VCR so it would stop blinking 12, 12, 12, and Joseph would ask him if he'd read the manual. Pop would answer, "I read those things, they tell me nothing." He would come home and fall asleep 5 minutes into any movie and wake up during the credits and want to be told blow by blow the entire plot and who was in it. But because he was always so busy, he seldom knew the names of even famous actors, as he paid little attention to popular culture, unless it happened to cross his path directly in some work forum or some other chance encounter. And even though he regularly found himself rubbing shoulders with celebrities, he seldom knew who they were unless someone told him. When he met Steven Spielberg at a recording session during his work on AI, he said, "I think we might have worked together before. Did you do Close Encounters of the Third Kind?" The only guy in the world who actually needed clarification on that point. And when Spielberg answered that he indeed had, Paul told him how he had voiced the turbid guy in the desert, intoning the Kodai tones that were repeated by a mass of others, and Spielberg and he bonded over it with a smile and a handshake. I'd like to think Spielberg enjoyed the novelty of actually meeting someone who didn't already know who he was. When he was hired as a coach to Robert De Niro on the film True Confessions, he had to ask my brother Joseph and me who the guy was he any good? One day during the break from the preparation for one of the All-State choirs in his rehearsal, a member of the group posed the question, "Sir, what is your greatest achievement?" He remembered being surprised at the passion and conviction of his answer, "My family," which seemed to come blurting out of him with such truth and no previous thought that he found himself discovering the answer along with everyone else listening. No matter what he accomplished from thenceforth, he never felt compelled to alter his answer. He reveled in the accomplishments of his children and wondered with true incredulity how they managed to become who they were with his genes and infrequent parenting as obstacles. He always had the good sense to attribute it to the many and profound gifts of my mother, whose own heart's muses include an intense compassion and faith, kindness and commitment, wisdom and intelligence, imagination and creativity. Many people have mentioned the feeling of family inclusion they always felt around Paul. And though his unpretentiousness and sincerity did have some effect in that, it was my mom who was the one who came up with the idea and execution of the choir picnics, the end-of-the-year parties, the senior dinners, and who made everyone feel at home around the house where you could always drop in without ceremony. But no one benefited more from the voluminous gifts of heart that my mother brings to life and have her children. No discussion of my father is complete without her more than profound influence. He would have been nothing like who he became without her partnership and encouragement. And as he proclaimed publicly on more than several occasions, my mother is truly the one who can more and share in the bows and the applause. As a child, we didn't see a lot of our father, as his many jobs took him away from home quite a bit. But all of us sang for him as kids, and we got to know him through the music. And though he may not have been much of a hands-on presence around the house with us, his example of passionate commitment to the excellence within each of us has been a constant beacon to his sons. And this has never been more apparent than when one of us have worked for or with one another. And to watch his face when all the family was around the big table in the dining room was truly to see the proverbial cat that ate the canary. It never got better for him than that, even if he was soon asleep after sitting there. Many of us thought that after his work, he'd be the kind of guy who would retire and then never wake up the next morning. But he enjoyed puttering around the house, watching TV, reading, going to Costco on Tuesdays with my mom, and enjoying their dates to watch Dancing with the Stars and Dodger games with the miraculous Vin Scully calling the play-by-play. Vinny was the only guy against whom Pop ever measured his length of years of service at St. Charles, having both started their jobs within a year of one another and both being born in 1927. But eventually the choir loft steps got higher, longer, and harder, and he decided it was time to call it a day. He still managed to take the occasional workshop or rehearsal here or there, and even a road gig or two though. One day when I was home visiting a couple of years ago, we were sitting in his TV room when the phone rang with a small offer. As he began asking the usual questions about the scope of the job, he suddenly said, "You know, I think I'm actually done. But I thank you for the offer," before graciously wishing the caller well and hanging up. And just like that, it was all done. I was pretty surprised at how simple, spontaneous, and unequivocal the decision was for him. He was just fine not doing the music anymore. Given his all-or-nothing dedication to it, I'm sure he probably felt if he couldn't do it the way he used to, that it wasn't worth doing at all. But he loved hearing the recordings from time to time as he got a chance to rediscover the nuance he had previously created, hearing it almost as if for the first time. He seemed to genuinely be surprised at how it had turned out. It was a fun thing to do with him, as many here know. Even in the hospital room a few months ago, when someone brought by a CD of his work for him to listen to, he was able to raise his eyebrows the same way he used to when hearing something surprising and pleasing. In truth, he never tried to pretend he was as equal to the task of directing an orchestra as he was a choir. But in the early days of the spring chorale, when Father Tran got the finest musicians in the city to populate the orchestra, to play with a bunch of college kids in a volunteer church choir, many of the hardened old pros who could afford to be jaded by even the best frequently asked after a rehearsal or two whether there were any tickets left with their families. They could hear the beautiful sounds and tremendous heart that was present in these singers. The choirs may have been amateurs, but they were passionately inspired by the vision that Paul had promised and was now delivering as it all came together. One time, he was rehearsing the choir a cappella while the instrumentalists patiently waited and listened. The orchestra applauded or tapped their bows customarily on their music stands in appreciation. Paul then said to them, "I appreciate so much the artistry and the dedication you bring to the playing of your instruments here. This is my instrument." And while this may explain much about him and his awareness of what he actually did, it doesn't fully capture the formula. Just like in that darkened movie theater so many years ago when he heard the Ave Maria for the first time, it was actually his heart and the love of the music that he was making that was the vehicle that allowed him full access to his real instrument. The hearts of those who sang with him and of those in the audience who regularly seemed to experience their own Ave Maria moment through him as they all scaled the mountaintop over and over. And through that shared love of the music, it was this lesson of heart that so many of us learned to bring not just to music, but to anything we do in life. It's what brought so many of us here today. So Pop, here is truly your instrument. Now we get to pay it forward.